Hi, welcome back to the Sounds Like Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Deborah Henne, and I'm here today with Barry Adkins, who, after losing his 18-year-old son Kevin to alcohol poisoning, as he saw it, he had two choices. He could curl up in a corner and allow himself to become a victim, or he could get out and tell as many people as possible about what happened to his son. And Barry chose the latter. In an effort to raise awareness about the dangers of binge drinking, Barry set out on an epic 1,400-mile journey on foot from Arizona to Montana with his son's ashes in his backpack, stopping at numerous schools, churches, and treatment facilities along the way to share his story. Welcome, Barry.
Thanks for having me on, Deborah.
So there's so much in here to unpack. So
There
you
is.
you had a son, and obviously
Yeah.
he was making some choices that were not in line with family values. And I mean, even just as a parent myself, and having teens, um, and you kind of watch, their choices, and if they're making choices that aren't in line with family values, as a parent, you start to go into like, I don't know, maybe as a mom, we have
Yeah.
feelings that can get pretty big. It's like,
Yes.
oh no.
Yes.
So how do you handle that as a parent when you have a child who you see making some pretty destructive choices?
Well, honestly, we didn't know there was a problem, and that's on us, right? There was a couple times that I had suspected maybe he was drinking, but because he's a teenager, right? You always wonder about that. But there was no indication that there was a problem. In fact, we had I didn't talk to him a lot about alcohol, but we have a relative who was an alcoholic, still is an alcoholic, a recovering alcoholic. And he always talked about how stupid he was and how he was never going to let that happen to him. So I thought he understood what could happen, but I was wrong.
Wow. So looking back, are there red flag indicators that you are like, on hindsight, I should have keyed into this?
I certainly would have talked to him more about it. 100%. I would have done that more. I learned later too that So Kevin's biological mother and I are divorced. I had custody of him. When he got into high school, he was primarily with me, but then he started wanting to go over to his mom's on the weekends. And I thought, I'm kind of a naive guy. I'm pretty gullible. I'm like, well, that's a good idea. You go over there and spend some time with your mom. I want you to do that. I found out a few years later that the reason he was doing that was because she was letting him drink over there. So again, it's something that didn't even occur to me to think, well, I wonder if they're drinking over there. It just something again, I'm as I always say when I talk, I'm that guy. These things didn't even occur to me that they might happen.
So it sounds like trust, just kind of that balance between trusting your teen and checking. And that's a tough balance because
It is.
I tend to be on the other side where I probably overcheck. And then they get upset with me, and as I go through their text messages and I go through their phone logs, and they're like, oh my gosh, mom. But like, I know,
Understood.
it's in today's day and age, like it's very different from
You
when
have
I
to.
was young, and I feel like I have to. um but so walking that trust and check balance and boundary is really hard, and it's hard to know what that right balance is, and I think each child would be different too. um
It is. It is. And in looking back on it, would I have checked more? Of course I would have. Right. But he really was never in any trouble. His high school principal didn't even know who he was.
mm,
Right. And so things like that, you know, makes you think it's okay. And his friends didn't really throw any red flags at me that there was a problem there. I mean, did some of the kids have friends that threw red flags? Yeah. And I was all over it. Right. I, you talked about family values. I had a daughter that brought a guy over one time for dinner, and he sits down at the dinner and he's wearing a beanie. And I'm like, dude, we don't wear beanies at the table, you know. So I had no problem, and I was suspicious of him right from the beginning when he did that. I know, everybody's different, but if I saw something, I would definitely say something.
Right. Right. Sure. So I'm sure that, after this happens in you, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of how does this happen? Can you talk to us about the after effects and just walking yourself through that and coming into a place where you made that decision that I'm not going to curl up in a ball and be a victim?
Well, I had a lot of help with that, Deborah. Um, After Kevin died, I was just in a daze, right? You're surprised the sun comes up in the morning. You're surprised there's still people driving down the road. I mean, you think the whole world came to a stop. And frankly, I was angry with God. And I told him so. And I used a lot of bad language. And I told him, take me. Back up time. You're God, right? Take me. Let my son live. A couple days after that, I had, and I'm a little bit of grace here, I had another life changing event. It was around 4 o'clock in the morning. I was laying in bed, I was awake. And the best way I can describe it is, when somebody walks in a room, but you haven't seen them yet, I felt like someone had walked in the room. There was a light I'd never seen before and haven't seen since. But the message was very brief and very clear. Kevin didn't suffer, and something very good would come from this. And then the light was gone. And I'm left going, wait, wait, wait. What does that mean to me? What,
Yeah.
what do you mean by that? Right. And so I'm not here to tell you that made everything okay, because it didn't, but it gave me a mission. What? And that's still what I'm doing. Right. People say something very good has come from this, but I don't know if it's the something very good. Right.
Yeah. I think I hear a thread of hope there too. That
Yeah.
when you had that encounter with, I believe it was God, a God
It
encounter,
was God. It was
that
100%.
um that and that's so God, right? He meets us where we're at, and then he gives us that hope, and he gives that, you know, pick yourself up and let's keep going. Here's a mission. Um, and that hope is so key to overcoming a lot of those life's challenges. I mean, the Bible will talk about hope being a helmet, so it like guards our mind,
Yes.
our thoughts. Um, and I'm sure that you had community around you too, to kind of to be there to help you as you processed through all this.
We did, and one of the things that I understood early on was we weren't going to play the blame game. Uh, there was plenty of blame to go around. The guy that rented he had a house he had rented, and he was 28 years old, and he's renting it to 18-year-old, renting rooms out to 18 years old. Um, he got in some trouble over that. The police had been to that place a few times, but I just didn't want to chase any of that because it wasn't going to bring him back. I know there's a lot of folks that when something happens to their child, they get involved in politics and in laws, and I think that's a good thing. It just wasn't my thing. I just didn't want to focus on that. I wanted to focus on the future.
So can you talk a little bit about that? Because as you mentioned, whether it's a big thing or a little thing, I think sometimes it's human nature to want to try to blame and point fingers. So how did you keep yourself from doing that? Are there any strategies or?
It was a God thing. I've been a Christian. I grew up Catholic, and I converted. I start now go to a Bible church, right? And I, you know, I understood what the Bible taught us, but not at the level that you do when you start looking at it after something like this happens. words in the Bible mean completely different things. You know, when James says, "Count it all joy, my brothers," right? When you meet trials of various kinds, yeah, everybody smiles and nods and goes, "Yeah." But then it happens to you, and you go, "Well, there's no joy there yet,"
Right.
right?
Right.
That's after the fact.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's true. Like to have a head knowledge of a revelation and an understanding, and then to have an experiential knowledge where you've had to live through it and walk through it are two totally different things.
They are
I
completely
always say,
different things.
when, because I do speaking also, and when I'm preparing, a lot of times God has me walk through that message before I release it, or even in the prophetic. A lot of times He has me walk through that revelation, and there's a whole lot that goes with that that I think people
There
don't
is.
grasp. Um, but yeah, that walking through that revelation of joy and hope is so different after you go through something as tragic as what you've been through. But
Yeah.
but God gave you that hope, and then He gave you a mission. Can you talk to us more about the mission and that walk? I want to hear about that walk.
Well, I didn't know what it meant. That's what I'm saying is something very good will come from this. Well, what is that? I have a bake sale, right? You
Yeah.
know, I wrote a letter to the editor. You know, they published that. That was nice. Okay, is that it? Well, no. And then as we kind of wrestled with what to do with his ashes, um, you know, what do we do with him? Well, one of his friends had said, well, he always liked Montana. Maybe you should take him there. Well, Kevin's favorite movie was something called Lonesome Dove. Maybe there's people in the audience that are familiar with it. The original movie, not the series, with Tommy Lee Jones and Robert Duvall. That was his favorite movie. And I highly recommend you watch it. It's about a 3.5 hour movie, but it was his favorite movie. And that's where the idea to walk to Montana came from. Because in the movie, someone takes a body from one state to another. He did it on horseback. It's a Western. And that's where, in my mind, it all came together. Originally, I was going to walk the Continental Divide, but then, you know, and I'm not going to be able to do the speaking stuff, right? And then I had to go try to find people to help me with that. And I'm not that kind of guy, right? It was out of my comfort zone. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Wow. So, and I think of that because I had a guest on here before, and there's somebody in my personal life that does a lot of prayer walking. And even just the distance, the shoes that you go through, like you don't think about this stuff. Where do you spend the night? The shoes that you go through, because you go through more than one pair of shoes. And I'm thinking, like,
Oh yeah,
do you just like stop at a shoe store and like buy shoes because you need another pair of shoes? Because I don't know that I want to carry how many pairs of shoes on my back, as I'm
yeah. I had a lot of help, right? An organization here in town, notmykid.org. It's a nonprofit. They really managed all of the speaking stuff, but I had to give them a schedule, right? I had to say, I'm going to be in this town on this day. This is how many miles a week I'm going to walk. Here's where I'm going to be. And I had to stick to that. And
Mhm.
so there was a lot of logistics, and I didn't sleep under bridges. So we had to figure out hotels, and this predates GPS and a lot of the other handy things that are out there now. You know, you got to figure out what time do I leave to be there. And as I was telling some students last week, keep in mind that when so it was from Gilbert, Arizona to Kalispell, Montana. Um, a few days after I left, I slept at home for a few days, but then it was time to leave. We had to pack everything we were going to need for 4 months in a truck
Mhm.
and hit the road. So there was a fair amount of logistics that my wife Bev, she managed all of that stuff, made sure I had everything I needed. Uh, Obviously, there were physical challenges. Believe it or not, I don't know how familiar you are with Arizona, but you think of Arizona as a flat desert. There were more mountains to go over to get out of Arizona than Utah, Idaho, or Montana. There's mountains in those states too, don't get me wrong. But in Arizona, I leave Gilbert, it's at 1,300 feet elevation, Flagstaff, 7,200 feet. and there's a lot of hills. There's a lot of up and down between here and there. So it
And it's
was a
hot.
physical thing.
I mean, really hot.
Well, we left. We had so that was another thing. When do you leave? I would rather have kind of left in April or May, but then I wouldn't be able to hit the schools, right? So I had to leave in February. So there was a lot of snow. Some of the snow I dealt with was in Arizona because there's snow in northern Arizona. Flagstaff,
Really?
7,200 feet. There's snow up there.
Wow. See, did not know that.
And you
Something new.
learned something new today.
Something new. But even like sore feet and things like pushing through blisters on your feet and things like that. And you're like, I have to get to this mile marker by this time or it doesn't work. And my feet are killing me. Like, how do you deal with things like that? Like the time and pushing through the physical barriers.
So interesting. So yeah, I had blisters the size of a quarter. I had plantar fasciitis, if you're familiar with that. I had to try to manage that. I had a knee that was pretty sore. And, I've been asked, did I ever think about quitting? And the answer to that is no. But I didn't even get to Flagstaff before I started wondering what I had gotten myself into, right? Because it was cold. It was a day, it was cold. It was raining. It was, 35 degrees, the wind, all of the things I don't like about walking. And I started thinking, man, oh man, oh man, I have probably bit off more than I can chew here. But I kind of changed my mindset. And it's a good metaphor for life because, I was thinking about another 1,300 miles to walk. That's all I thought about was, man, I got 3 more states to go through and I'm already whipped. But I decided to not think about that and just think about walking 3 more miles and I'm going to take a break. Right? I'm going to go 3 miles. I'm going to take a break, see how I feel, get up and walk again. And it's a good metaphor for life because you don't realize what you can accomplish in a lifetime because you think, man, that's too big of a project. But it's those baby steps that suddenly there you are in Montana.
Yeah, and I was gonna say that too. I mean, that's so true for anything in life. Like when you have a big project that you're pushing into, you start off, you're so excited, you have your vision, you're like, rah, rah, yeah. And then you get to Flagstaff and you're like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? I can't do this because the journey ahead is so overwhelming. But
Yeah.
just like you said, small chunks, bite-sized chunks. The Bible talks about build like an ant, work like an ant. And that's how they do it. One grain at a time. They don't look at the
Yeah.
whole anthill.
No,
they
you
each
don't.
do their job one at a time. And it's what they can do. And by the end, there's an anthill.
Yeah.
Um, so true, so powerful having that mission, that hope, that focus, bite-sized chunks to reach your goals. And I'm gonna put up your website here. What can people find on your website at Kevin's Last Walk?
Probably the best thing you can find there is a link to Facebook. I post everything that I do on Facebook because people tend to want to go there anyway. And there's a link on there. There's some stuff on there. I used to keep a blog on there, but I do everything on Facebook now. So I like this podcast, or I started putting excerpts from the book on there. I've spoke at bunch of schools this fall. I got some great feedback from some of the students there, and I posted that on there. So that'll have a link to that, which is where I put everything. And there's a fair amount of material there.
Okay. So you do have a book. Can you tell people what your book is about and what they can expect if they decide and where they can get it?
Well, it's easy to get. It's on Amazon. It's Kevin's Last Walk, A Father's Final Journey with Your Son, with my son. But um, for that, Amazon is the best place to get it. Writing the book was another thing. I got done with the walk and I had kept a blog, right? Back then, they gave me a site and I could go and kind of journal every day. And so I had, several months worth of journal stuff. And I have a good friend. I called him and I said, hey, I'm going to print out this journal and put it in a 3-ring binder. You want a copy of it? And he said, nope. And I'm like, okay. He goes, because you're going to write a book, or I'm going to know the reason why. And I said, no, I'm not. Because I was pretty averse to taking on big tasks at that point, right? And writing a book is a big task. But I don't know, 6 months or a year later, I decided to do it. I'm glad I did it. I tell people all the time, if you've gone through something major in your life, write it down. Mm-hmm. Because you're going to forget the details of all of that. And it's kind of fun to go back and look through it and go, oh, yeah, that happened. That happened. But it was more work doing that than walking to Montana. Because walking to Montana, I'm an engineer by trade. I know exactly what I need to do every day, right? I need to get 14 miles in every day. But writing a book uses a different part of your brain. And honestly, the person that helped the most with it was Stephen King. He wrote a book on writing. A lot of stuff in the book, but one of the things he said that helped me the most was he said, there's two parts to writing a book. There's the creative part, and then there's more the straightforward stuff, like where does this go? And that really helped me a lot, because he said he would go in, close the door, and this is what I did with no distractions. And he said, just write. Don't worry about where it's going to go or if it's ever going to go anywhere. Just keep going. Kind of a stream of consciousness. Mm-hmm. Then later you go in with more of the logical side and say, okay, this doesn't really advance the story. It's coming out. Right. And he said that. He said, if your original book is 300 pages and you don't cut it down to 200, you did something wrong. Yeah. So that was very helpful for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a writer, I have to agree with that.
Well, you're a writer. Okay. So you know all of this.
Go in and you just create, and that's one part of the brain. And I try to have no distractions. That doesn't always happen in my life, but
right.
But you get in that creative flow, and then in a separate sitting, I have to go back and edit, and that's more that analytical. Okay, what needs to be cut? What can stay? Does it stay there, or does it go somewhere else?
Absolutely. How do you manage, time, right? Do you put things at the beginning that tell you what's going to happen and then fill in the backdrop? How do you manage all of that? That's the creative part. I also had book clubs read it. And, because as a writer, this. If you ask, for me, if I asked my friends and family to read it, you know what they said? It's great. You're a liar.
Yeah, right. Like, no.
So the book club was people I didn't know, and I went, I gave it to them. They read it, and we got together and went around the room. Okay, what did you like about the book? But what I really wanted to know was what they didn't like about the book, and that was the most constructive part. There were several things that I fixed, but the one that's the most memorable for me. One of the ladies said, "You told me more about your shoe selection than you did about how you felt when you finished the walk." I'm a guy, right?
Yeah, you're like, well.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But no, but it was good. They gave you the feedback you need, because your friends and family, most of them haven't even read the book, but they're going to say, yeah, it's great.
Yep. You're like, no, okay, this is a great starting point, but I want to push to the next level and make it, even better. Yeah, no, I hear you there. So now you also do speaking. Can you tell us about the venues that you speak at and what kind of message you bring?
So it's interesting. This is a Christian podcast, so I will tell you, at schools, I'm not allowed to tell them about how God impacted my life. But they get the message. I talk about three things, right? I talk about decision making, adversity, and forgiveness, which are all biblical truths. I just don't quote them chapter and verse. But I'm going to read. Let me see if I can find it here. I have something I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. Let's get up here. Okay. Hearing a story like that just made me think there is no way God wasn't helping him, especially what you said about forgiveness. I really liked how you brought attention to not only forgiving others, but the importance of forgiving yourself. I can tell you grew so much as a person, and this unfortunate experience really made you better. I truly think it's an inspiration to help others by sharing your story and made me want to help others with mine. So the God part is there.
Mhm.
It's really interesting. One of the schools. So I this fall I probably spoke at 25 schools in some capacity, and for me, it's just interesting when I get feedback like this. One of the schools actually had them write thank you notes, which I thought, okay, but generally a thank you note is thanks for coming in. But I ended up summarizing it. There was 7 pages of stuff like that. Just you could tell they were listening, and I call it the grandfather effect because I'm 2 generations apart from them, so I think they listen a little more.
Mhm. Well, so powerful. And yeah, and you pointed out in that letter, it's so true. When you have things, especially things that are hard to forgive, you need God. You
Yeah,
need God's grace and His revelation of love and forgiveness and freedom in order to take that step because it's hard. And you mentioned forgiving yourself, so important. And also, I think one of the hardest people to forgive is myself. you know,
yeah,
and I think, and I've heard that from quite a few people too. So I'm like, I'm not a weirdo. you know, that it's so hard to forgive ourselves, but also so, so important. I mean, God forgave us. We are
yeah.
forgivable. We can forgive ourselves,
How
right?
many times is forgiveness used in the Bible? Probably 1,000 times. I don't know.
Right. Absolutely. So key and so key to living in freedom is that
Yeah,
forgiveness. It doesn't remove the wrongdoing. It doesn't remove, any kind of consequences or whatever. It just is freedom. It's freedom in our minds. It's freedom in our hearts. So
yeah,
what
it's
a
letting
powerful,
go. Yeah,
yeah,
freedom.
yeah,
It's letting go of all that stuff.
absolutely. Well, thank you for coming and sharing your story of hope and freedom, even in the midst of tragedy. So check out his website, kevinslastwalk.com. Check out his book. He is a speaker, so come have him at your school, at your church, at your event.
Absolutely.
Bring his powerful message of hope and forgiveness, even in the midst of tragedy. And don't forget to swipe, tap, or click over to deborahhenne.com. Follow me on social on the X, Instagram, or Facebook at Deborah Henne Author. And let's not forget to tune into our thoughts to make sure they sound like Jesus's, so they sound like freedom.